Welcome to the Neurologic podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we will be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is Neurologic.
Today, we're talking about something that is relevant for a lot of families. What happens when aging and memory loss start to affect an individual's ability to manage their finances? Our guest today, Dr. Daniel Marson, is someone who's uniquely positioned to talk about this. Although he has since retired, Dr. Marson is both a clinical neuropsychologist and a licensed attorney. He's an emeritus professor in the Department of Neurology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where he also directed the UAB Alzheimer's Disease Center. He spent decades researching how cognitive decline, particularly in conditions like Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, affect financial decision-making and what families and society can do about it. Dr. Marson has published over 100 papers and book chapters on the intersection of cognitive decline, financial capacity, and legal protections. He has been a leader in studying how cognitive impairments can increase the vulnerability of older adults to financial exploitation, a problem that has significant implications for families and society. During our conversation, we talk about financial vulnerability, like how cognitive changes impact financial decision-making, how we can identify early signs of financial difficulties, and what legal protections families can put in place to safeguard their loved ones. Whether you're concerned about an aging family member or planning for your own future, this episode has a lot of essential information about navigating the challenges of financial capacity in older adults. This conversation is a great reminder to start those financial planning talks early. In his personal life, Dr. Marson enjoys playing the diatonic harmonica and is passionate about blues and jazz music. In fact, it's his music you're hearing right now. He has even published in the jazz magazine Downbeat. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Dr. Marson, thank you so much for joining us today. So you have a pretty unique background. You have both a clinical neuropsychology background and you're also a licensed attorney. So how did those two worlds come together for you, and what got you interested in studying financial vulnerability in older adults?
Well, it's a big question, kind of a long history behind it. I'll try to shorten it as much as I can, but I started my career practicing law as an attorney. And then I saw the light and became interested in psychology and then in clinical neuropsychology. One of the things I was told when I went to UAB was that I needed to have a research program, and I thought, what would be a good research topic? And a good research topic seemed to be competency, that is the capacity to make medical decisions, the capacity to make a will, the capacity to make good financial decisions. And so my interest in this area really arrived as a result of my dual background in both law and in clinical psychology.
So how long were you practicing as a lawyer before you switched over?
I practiced for about 3 to 4 years before I retrained as a clinical psychologist.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is financial capacity? What kind of skills are we talking about when we talk about somebody's ability to manage money?
Well, we're talking about the ability to manage money and assets in ways that are consistent with a person's values and which are also aligned with their self-interest.
So something that would allow them to function independently and be able to take care of themselves.
Exactly. Financial capacity is a set of skills that's really important to independent living.
So things like, as basic as counting money, to understanding debts and loans, to, paying bills, that's all encompassed in this financial capacity when we're talking about that.
Yes, it really includes a wide range of different skills, performance skills of various kinds. As you mentioned, counting coins and currency, writing checks, using an ATM machine, but also making good decisions. So there's a performance aspect to financial capacity, but there's also a decision-making aspect to it.
So recent research has shown that around 1 in 20 older adults get financially exploited. So why does cognitive decline as we age make us more vulnerable to these financial scams?
Cognitive decline affects a person's ability to detect scams right from the get-go. It will affect a person's ability to determine whether an offer being made is bona fide or not. It will affect a person's ability to trust a person who might be approaching them on a financial matter. It'll affect their ability to evaluate the pros and cons of a particular offer. Cognitive decline affects decision-making financially, and one aspect of decision-making is deciding whether or not a proposal is kosher or not.
So a lot of people assume, talking about decision making, a lot of people assume that older adults are just bad decision makers. That makes them automatically more vulnerable to these scams. But according to a lot of research now, that's not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily that adults are just bad at making decisions. So what has your research shown on this? Does decision making decline as we age, and is it related to financial competence?
I think the ability to make good decisions as a whole may decline generally over time for older adults, but not in every case. So people differ. But with normal cognitive aging, we know that people's short-term memory, their processing speed, their fluid intelligence, their numeracy and arithmetic skills, all of these things are declining, and so it makes it harder for them to make good decisions. Now, they may still make good decisions if given enough time, but there's a risk that their decision-making will decline. And so I guess I might differ on that in the sense that I guess if you give a person unlimited time, they might be able to make an equivalent decision that they would make 20 years earlier. But we don't have unlimited time to make decisions, and so I think older adults are at a disadvantage, particularly if they're pressured to make decisions before they're actually ready to make the decision.
Yeah, especially in hospital settings when they're experiencing, health concerns. A lot of times they have to make these decisions, and there's already so much stress going around, and they have to immediately make these decisions. So I can see how that becomes more difficult. So you kind of touched a little bit about processing speed declines as we age. There's also something called executive control. So that has also been shown to decline as we age. Could you explain what exactly executive control is and how it relates to financial decisions?
Well, executive control has to do with planning and organization and being able to engage in goal-oriented activities. It, like the other cognitive abilities I mentioned, is subject to decline over time in aging. If people are slower, they may not think of all the contingencies to a problem. They may not be able to plan A to B to C to D in the same way that they could 20 or 30 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And so their ability to make a good financial decision, that particularly if it's complex and has multi-stages, is subject to decline because of diminished executive control.
So I'm curious, how do we know these financial difficulties are actually related to aging or cognitive decline and not because someone's always struggled with financial capacity? So for example, personally, I'm not the greatest at managing money. So in your previous research, what you did, how do you know that, the individuals that you're measuring with these financial capacity instruments were not always bad at it because you didn't follow them from their, previous years ago? You're only looking at them at that one time point.
Well, you don't. You can rely on perhaps collateral report from a family member saying that this is not the way my dad used to think. This is not the way my dad used to make financial decisions. If you have the luxury of multiple assessments, you can see interval change over time in which the person is declining over the space maybe of a year on the same kinds of problems that were tested earlier. But at one time point, you often have to struggle with the fact that has this person just always made bad financial decisions versus this represents an interval decline and new behavior for the person.
So in that case, family members' collateral sources are so important in assessing these and understanding the adult's changes.
So we've talked in a previous episode about how cognitive decline can affect future planning. So as people experience changes in memory or executive function, does that make it harder to plan ahead? And in turn, does that make it tougher to manage money more effectively?
I would say yes to both of those. If you're experiencing declining executive function, it's going to impact a wide variety of areas of independent living, and financial capacity is going to be high on the list because it's complex. It involves a lot of moving parts, and again, it involves both performance skills and decision-making skills. I think that would be a cause for concern. I agree with your premise there.
Yeah, I guess one of the worrying things about this is that impairment in financial capacity usually occurs very early in the course of cognitive impairment. So it might be before the patient or before their family members are even aware of deficits coming up in their financial skill. And so it's a case of, do you catch it before too much damage has been done in their financial standing?
That's absolutely true, is that I think changes in financial capacity are some of the very earliest functional changes that flow from cognitive decline. It's like the canary in the coal mine in terms of problems that are now moving from being simply cognitive to being functional, to affecting everyday living skills.
Yeah, because I think when people think of cognitive decline, the first thing they jump to is memory. But this is something that actually would come into play before then, and so
it can come after too. But basically, the point is that when there's cognitive changes, the first functional changes are often in the area of finances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like if they came after memory, you would already be aware that, this person is suffering some kind of cognitive decline, because memory is such an obvious thing that we look for, and then you'd be more aware of what they're doing financially. Whereas when it comes before, it might be a bit harder to catch. So you've actually developed something called the Financial Capacity Instrument, which measures financial skills, which is how well people are managing their money. So what kind of things does it look at, and is it used in clinical settings?
The Financial Capacity Instrument is a research instrument that was developed in the 2000 timeframe as a research tool for understanding financial decline in Alzheimer's disease. It has 9 domains of activity that it evaluates: basic monetary skills, conceptual knowledge, cash transactions, checkbook management, bank statement management, financial judgment, and also looks at investment decision-making for certain people who have that as prior experience, and at estate planning. And then what we did with that model, that was really a model of financial capacity for independent living older adults, we operationalized that with tasks that allowed us to see how well they were actually managing their money, or how well they were actually using a checkbook, or how well they were detecting fraud in a financial judgment situation. The measure has always been in the research realm, so it's not being used clinically. We have a short form version of it, is not being used clinically in everyday practice at this time, but it is being used as a research tool.
So what are some of the earliest signs in how someone handles their finances that might hint at early cognitive changes? So, for example, if we have someone in our life that is showing those signs, how would we recognize them, and what are the first steps we would have to take to address that?
Yeah, well, for someone who knows the individual well, changes that might represent early declines would include slowing on tasks that previously were done more quickly. There are different ways of thinking about that. Maybe taking a long time to write out checks and record them in a check register. Or another example of that might be the person is just not paying attention to the need to prepare his tax return or her tax return this year, and is taking an inordinate amount of time to pull out the documents and get things in the form that they needed to meet their filing deadline. Another characteristic early sign is problems with everyday arithmetic, where there are problems with subtraction, multiplication, addition, division, and again, these are uncharacteristic errors that indicate the person is struggling with basic forms of financial knowledge that previously they came easily to them. Another early warning sign that we have identified is not being aware of important information in financial documents. There might be a document you receive in which you are being told that you're overdue on a bill, and the individual just overlooks that. So those are three examples of early warning signs that might motivate family members to have their elder checked out.
So loss of financial capacity and medical decision-making is such a large issue in individuals with Alzheimer's disease and other age-related neurodegenerative disorders. So could you walk us through how financial capacity changes as someone moves from mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, into moderate Alzheimer's disease? But first, for the people listening, what is the difference between MCI and Alzheimer's disease?
MCI is a syndrome, and Alzheimer's disease is an actual disease. You might want to phrase the question as, what is the difference between Alzheimer's disease and MCI and dementia? MCI and dementia are syndromes that are sort of clusters of symptoms that are associated together, whereas Alzheimer's disease is an actual disease, neurodegenerative disease. Alzheimer's disease will go through an MCI stage, or syndromic stage, and then as it progresses, it will move into a dementia stage. So that would be an initial clarification I would make on that. In terms of the kinds of financial changes that flow from mild cognitive impairment as a stage to moderate Alzheimer's dementia, that's a long period of time. We could be talking about 6 to 8 years of time. If the patient has Alzheimer's disease and they're at the MCI stage, what they will likely have, at least in the early MCI stage, is short-term memory loss. And they might have a little bit of word finding. And in terms of their financial abilities, they'll have very mild to minimal effects on finances at this point. They might have trouble a little bit with their checkbook. They might have a little trouble with a complex activity like bank statement management. But overall, they're managing their financial skills sufficiently well that it's not viewed to be an obvious area of deficit. As they move into mild Alzheimer's dementia, they're going to have more widespread cognitive impairments. They will have more problems with executive function. Their memory loss will have progressed. Their word finding and language problems will have progressed. And by the time they reach that stage, they're having problems in a number of financial areas. The only area that really is relatively preserved might be basic monetary skills. All the other areas that I've mentioned previously are going to be showing some level of deficit. And it's going to be obvious to family members that finances has now been affected. One of the definitions, of course, of dementia is that you have functional change that is significant and unmistakable, and financial capacity is one of the first to show that kind of level of change. By the time you move into moderate Alzheimer's dementia, where the person got very significant widespread cognitive changes. They have changes functionally in all areas of life: driving, medication, personal care. Their financial abilities are basically completely impaired. There's not an area that is preserved. So I know I gave you a long-winded, detailed answer there, but again, you're talking about a 6 to 8 year process in that kind of description.
So you've written about the underlying neural changes that can predict financial exploitation risk and make someone more open to scams. So what's actually going on in the brain that makes people more susceptible to financial fraud?
Well, if you use Alzheimer's disease as your paradigm, you have neurodegenerative change in the hippocampus, in the parietal areas, in the frontal lobes, all of which are affecting a variety of cognitive functions that impact financial capacity. So, there are some specific areas of brain that we've tried to look at in our imaging studies, like the angular gyrus and the frontal lobes. But when you think about financial capacity, it is such a multidimensional, complex set of activities that you're going to have multiple brain areas that are implicated in trying to understand why there's decline.
And when you mentioned these brain areas that you saw, like the angular gyrus, were you looking at cortical structure, so like the thickness, or was it functional brain scan, so using like fMRI?
We were looking at volumetric measures of size.
Okay, so the size of the angular gyrus can correlate to somebody's financial capacity as they age.
That's we found that in patients with mild cognitive impairment, we found the association between the size of the angular gyrus and their financial skills on the FCI.
Okay, so that financial capacity instrument that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So these participants were already in the mild cognitive impairment stage?
They were.
Okay, so it was not healthy cognitive adults.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about what you said about how financial capacity is such a complex process that involves so many different parts of the brain, that kind of makes sense, and then that would be something that would come before other cognitive deficits, because it is such a kind of combination. Rather than just memory, you're looking at specific regions. With financial capacity, it does call on so many regions that it might be because of that an earlier.
Like we talked about the executive function decline, a lot of that has to do with like the prefrontal cortex, which is like the front area for brain. So there's really so many regions implicated in this.
So another thing you've talked about in your work is the brain's default mode network. So this is actually a network that is considered to be engaged by self-generated thought and is active across multiple functional domains, including memory, future thinking, autobiographical planning, and social cognition. So what have you found in terms of this network and how it relates to susceptibility to scams?
Well, we actually didn't find anything specific regarding scams. We did know that in trying to understand brain function in its relation to financial capacity, we wanted to look at the default mode network because it's preferentially affected by Alzheimer's disease. And so we were looking at cortical areas that are constitute the default mode network. And one of them is the inferior parietal lobule, which houses the angular gyrus. And we know the angular gyrus is an area of brain that's closely associated with arithmetic skills and also with language comprehension. And so we sort of targeted our initial MRI studies towards the default mode network for those reasons.
And I think also, like, a lot of times financial exploitation that happens, it tends to occur in social contexts. So I don't know if I read, I think in one of your papers, that actually a lot of times when older adults are financially exploited, it can be members that actually knew them. Mm-hmm. So the social context is also important in financial exploitation cases. And I think that a lot of these brain regions that we talked about, as they change with age, it can change social appraisal and things like that. So I'm wondering if that has something to do with making adults more at risk of believing certain financial situations.
Well, I think you're right. I think it can affect their appraisal of a family member and their intentions. Mm-hmm. And again, their ability to understand the context of the situation and the nuances of it, and whether or not their ability also to handle the stress of, say, a negative interaction may be diminished because of their cognitive changes.
Right.
So there are multiple determinants to a situation of exploitation, but these brain changes are certainly, at the heart of it.
So when it comes to money and decision making, there's also a legal side to that. So what kinds of protections should families think about that they need to put in place early before these issues come up?
Well, this is something that families often don't address, but legally the most helpful approach is to plan for a future possibility of diminished financial capacity. And the way you do that is by completing a durable power of attorney for finances, which allows you to choose someone who can take over financial decision making for you at some future point in time if it's needed, and allows you to be protected, hopefully, by that person should your own decision making fail you. So that's advanced directives for financial decision making are probably the most important step that one can make proactively when the individual might still be middle-aged, but anticipating a time in which they may no longer be able to make good decisions and having this in place. Now, saying that, you want to make a good decision as to who your proxy decision maker is going to be, because giving a durable power of attorney to someone is also giving them a license to steal, potentially, if they have bad intentions, if they have a different set of goals than your own welfare. But that's why you make these decisions at a time in which you can make an informed decision as to who the proxy decision maker is going to be.
So in cases where, let's say that wasn't the case, and family members are dealing with older adults where they're noticing these changes that are affecting their financial capacity, I'm sure it's difficult walking that line between protecting someone and also respecting their independence. So how would you advise families to navigate that tension?
Well, I think that it's based on effective communication with the elder who's declining, and that depends a lot on the dynamics of the relationship. I would say that the family wants to be able to communicate their concerns, let's say, to the elder who's declining financially, but do it in a way that doesn't antagonize them or trigger a negative reaction. And of course, that all depends on the personality of the elder, their position in the family, and a host of other factors. And so it's hard to give cut and dried advice on this because it's so family specific.
Right.
If it's the patriarch of the family, you might have a very difficult time convincing them that they're failing financially in their decision making and that they really need to turn over control to someone else. If it's someone who is reasonable and has a level of insight and is aware that at some point they need to turn over the checkbook to someone else, you could have an entirely different conversation. A lot depends on skill and diplomacy in the way you interact with family members.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, I'm sure, getting other healthcare professionals involved might be an easier way to do that as well, where they could, have a family meeting and the healthcare provider can advise the older adult.
That can help, but on the other hand, it could be that the entire context of that meeting is antagonistic to the elder who does not really happy about having to talk to their financial advisor about something that they didn't ask them to do.
Right, I can see that being an issue too. So you've written about what doctors should be doing to help spot financial problems in older adults. How well are healthcare professionals actually doing that right now?
Well, I think that we have to give them a lot of credit, because when we talk about, say, your internist working with older adults, they're dealing with a host of different issues related to that older adult. Their financial capacity is just one small piece. It might be an important piece in this particular case. And so I think that the internist needs to be mindful of concerns that family members may bring up regarding finances, or maybe that the older adult brings up. At the same time, I think we have to be careful about expecting healthcare professionals to be social workers and handling every family-related issue that might be coming up. And so I would kind of strike a compromise here and say that certainly inquiring as to whether there are functional changes that warrant attention, whether it's in driving, medication use, or in finances, is, I think, a legitimate question that the physician can ask. If a problem is referenced by the elder himself or herself or by the family members, then the physician might be in a position to make a referral to a specialist in the area, maybe a psychologist, to evaluate the person's financial skills or to follow up on them. So I think that I would say that overall physicians have, and again talking about internists, have a very broad plate of responsibilities regarding treating older adults, and they need to be mindful of financial capacity issues, but they can't be expected to make them a priority in every case.
With older adults, typically when they have their physicals with their internist, their cognitive ability is assessed somewhat. Would that give them any indication of whether this person might need some kind of referral, or would it just be down to the family saying, hey, I've noticed changes?
If you're doing, let's say, like a mini mental state and it's a low score, it would certainly indicate that further follow-up of cognition is needed. But whether or not financial capacity comes into the equation and into the discussion is another matter. You know, it depends, I think, on the decision-making and practice style of the physician. I want to be careful and not say that, you know, physicians are doing a bad job and they need to ask about financial capacity. I think that it arises in a case-by-case basis. You have to, again, give a lot of credit to the enormous responsibilities that internists have in caring for older adults in all of their dimensions.
So with so much banking and communication now happening online, how do you think technology has changed the risks that older adults face with money and finances?
I think it's made it more complicated because the digital world is, for people who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, is a world that they didn't grow up with. And so they're going to be less familiar with these modalities, and so they're more at risk. I think that older adults are still very familiar with these 20th century concepts of checkbooks and bank statements and so on. So if they're living in that world financially, operating in that world, they're going to do better. I think if they're online, which they may be, some of them may do well online, but I think I think as a whole, it's harder for older adults to navigate that world. And, you know, I would volunteer myself as an example of that. I think it's much easier for a 20-year-old to navigate online banking than it is for a 70-year-old.
Mm-hmm. But I think also going back to what you said earlier about if that 80-year-old had enough time, they probably would make the same decision they would have made 20 years ago. But with online banking, it's so instant, it's just a click of a button, that can kind of circumvent the time that they would have had to make a good decision and maybe fall for some kind of
and also I'm thinking, like, we were talking about how cognitive impairment as we age puts us at more risk for financial exploitation, but so does like limited experience with these new technology things. So what could be driving it is not necessarily the cognitive impairment, but the unfamiliarity with how to navigate.
Inexperience, and also things like not only inexperience with the technology, but a whole other area of inexperience, which is the current types of phishing scams.
Exactly, the phishing. That's what I was going to say.
Be aware of,
or like advertisements specifically targeted at older adults. Yeah. Like they didn't have the experience to be able to assess, is this a potential scam or not? Like you said, because they didn't grow up with it.
Right. They may be struggling with how to log in, much less, determine whether or not there's a problem in my bank account XX.
Right.
So as our population gets older, what kind of policy changes do you think would actually help to protect older adults better, both financially and legally?
Well, that's a big question. I think that it's important, and I think it's true, that financial capacity is recognized as an important scientific topic and it is an important public policy goal for older adults. I think public policy needs to find ways of better identifying older adults at risk for financial exploitation and also finding ways of better protecting them from financial exploitation. So identification and protection are the key goals.
And I think just like opening this conversation, because like Amber said earlier, like you don't hear much about how financial capacity declines with age. It's always about memory and cognition. So I think just having these conversations and start planning, like you had mentioned earlier, middle age, about how I'm going to have someone else manage my finances where I'm no longer able to, and just putting those into practice. I think it just needs to be more normalized. I don't think enough people talk about that until we're at this stage.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sooner rather than later, basically.
Exactly.
Start thinking about these things, yeah.
One protective development has been products like EverSafe. I don't know if you've heard of that product.
I have not.
Just a way of monitoring an older adult's bank accounts, something that the older adult agrees to. Will keep track of credit card transactions and deposits, withdrawals, and will identify unusual patterns that might warrant concern. And so it's a way of protecting the older adult and also protecting the older adult's family members who are worried about perhaps the older adult's well-being. And so it's a way of digitally monitoring financial activities and sending alerts to trusted third parties so that if there is some financial exploitation underway or being considered, it can be detected early and warded off. That's not a public policy goal in the broadest sense, but it's an example of the kind of sort of novel protections that are being developed to protect older adults and their financial capacity.
Yeah, that's really good to know. I didn't know something like that existed.
Same.
And especially going back to how things are more digital now, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, you could have checked the activity of the old adult through their paper statements coming in the mail. You could kind of walk into their home and get a sense for what's going on financially. Because everything is online, you wouldn't even know that they made a huge transaction or somebody did something, because it's all digital. So having things like that, I think, is really important.
Right.
Yeah. We can put more information about that in our podcast.
Oh, I'm sure EverSafe would love that.
Yeah. Please fund us.
So, Dr. Marson, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you so much for helping us understand how cognitive changes can affect financial decision-making and financial vulnerability as we age. This is something that so many families face, and especially with an aging population, so many more families are going to be facing. And you've given us a much better understanding of how we can better navigate these situations. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to Neurologic, a CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran for editing this episode. To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.